Hello and welcome. You're listening to No Lasting City, probably the second best podcast in the world. I'm Matthew Johnston, and with me today is Andrew Young and young Toby. No Lasting City is a ministry of Riverbend Bible Church in Hastings, New Zealand. And our goal with this podcast is to distract you from the mundane and to ravish your mind with the person and work and glory of Jesus Christ. Well, our guest today is Dr. Michael Riccardi and Dr. Peter Sammons. Listeners, if you've been listening to No Lasting City from the very beginning, you would have listened to episode 1, which, interestingly enough, was when we were called the Pactum Podcast for our very first episode. We then changed our name because of another podcast out there. But this was the very first episode. And so the band's back together. It's so great to have Mike and Peter with us. Mike Riccardi serves as the assistant professor of theology at the Master's Seminary. He grew up in central New Jersey. He serves as the pastor of local outreach ministries at Grace Community Church in Los Angeles. And Dr. Peter Sammons serves as the assistant professor of theology at the Master's Seminary, and he's the author of Reprobation and God's Sovereignty, Redeeming a Biblical Doctrine. Brothers, it's so glad to have us all back together, and it's so wonderful to have you joining us again. Thanks so much.
Yeah, glad to be here, brothers.
I should say something.
Peter likes being here too.
Yeah, it's good to be here.
we just so great to have you guys here. Gentlemen, brothers, look, Reformed Dispensationalism. The first episode we ever did as a podcast, as I said, was called Reformed Dispensationalism. There was a reaction back then, and there's been a reaction once again to this concept of Reformed Dispensationalism. Everything from, look, that doesn't exist, that is an utter oxymoron, that is inherently contradictory. And then other guys are like, look, I'm there, I see it, I appreciate it. And so, guys, let's just begin as we begin Reformed Dispensationalism Part 2. Let's begin to discuss, and we want to ask you, Mike and Peter, what is it that we're trying to get at with this, some might say, controversial label of Reformed Dispensationalism?
Yeah, I mean, I think that we're trying to say that we want to be consistently biblical. And the way that we see that happening, I mean, obviously everybody believes they want to be consistently biblical, but the way that we see that happening is in the affirmation of the truths of the wonderful articulation of biblical doctrine as bequeathed to us in the Protestant Reformation, in the Orthodox creeds, in the Reformed confessions, as it concerns the doctrine of God, the doctrine of Scripture, the doctrine of Christ, the doctrine of the Holy Spirit, the doctrine of the Trinity, the doctrine of man, the doctrine of sin, the doctrine of salvation. There is just so much about Reformed theology, the way that you would understand it, from inside, the Reformation, that we want to be able to, that we say amen to, that we want to be able to champion, that we teach because we believe it is a faithful representation of what God has revealed of himself in the scriptures. And at the same time, we believe that there is an aspect of the theological system called dispensationalism, aspects, plural, that are also reflective of biblical thought in ways that perhaps aren't most commonly associated with the Protestant Reformation or Reformed theology. And, that's obviously in particular our understanding of the distinction between the church and Israel, some very definite hermeneutical differences, and our understanding of the kingdom, the millennial kingdom of God, that's of Christ, that's going to happen in the future, where Christ reigns on the earth for 1,000 years, where it is not merely just a lot of Israelites or Jewish people get saved, join the church, and we have a kingdom on the earth, but that it is that the nation of Israel, in addition to the salvation of Jewish people, but a nation of Israel is regathered and reconstituted, and it returns to the land of Israel as stipulated in the Old Testament promises of the kingdom, and Israel receives her promises. And a lot of times, like you mentioned, people regard those things as inherently mutually exclusive. They'll say, to be reformed is to be non-dispensational. To be dispensational is to be non-reformed. They're mutually exclusive. They're oxymorons, to put them together. And I think our burden is the same hermeneutic that we use to get our understanding of all those wonderful truths of the 5 points of Calvinism, the active obedience of Christ, the triunity of God, the classical understanding of the attributes of God and of Christ's person. All of those same things, the hermeneutic that gets us those truths also gets us the things that I mentioned just before about Israel and the land and the kingdom and these sorts of things. I get that people disagree with that. I get that people laugh at that, but on our end, it's an attempt to try to maintain consistency all the way through, so that we read out of the scriptures what God's mind has for us, rather than read into it.
Yeah, I think also I'd highlight on top of that, the richness of Reformed theology and, the doctrine of predestination, the doctrine of the active obedience of Christ, all those wonderful truths that we get from the Protestant Reformation that, again, some of it was before, many of it contained therein, are really helpful. I mean, I think also when we look at great, treasure trove of confessions and creeds that we have, like the London Baptist Confession, in large part, it leaves room and allowance for divergent views on eschatology and things like that. And 90-something% of it we could affirm wholeheartedly without any kind of qualification or equivocation. But also, I'd say with like, even with dispensational, I mean, what does it mean? Who gets to define the term? There's obviously branches of dispensational that none of us want to affirm, that are downright heretical. Two ways of salvation, that what God had six attempts at this and failed on each one till the seventh, like, well, of course I don't even know of a group that affirms that anymore. So it depends on who gets to define the terms, right? I think when it comes to dispensationalism, I think what Mike said, that's kind of the core crux of it, is that a distinction between Israel and the church, especially with regard to the fulfillment of promises in the Old Testament, such as the land promises, that have not been fulfilled at this point, that will be fulfilled for us during the millennial kingdom. I think that there is a precedent for that throughout the Reformed theology and the history of Reformed theology. And also, so when we say Reformed dispensation, like, who gets to define that, I guess, is more where I'm going. But I think it is a matter of harmony, even sometimes more than hermeneutics. A lot of times that we throw that out there, like, oh, I mean, I think that the amillennialist guys in their mind have a grammatical, literal hermeneutic. They just think that it is intending to tell us something maybe metaphorical or something allegorical regarding the land promises, or however they want to explain those. So I think it's a matter of harmony, sometimes more than even hermeneutic. Like, how do we harmonize these texts? And I think that our model of having a, more, if you want to use the word dispensational, which again, I'm not a fan of the baggage that comes with that, but if you want to use that with regard to the future restoration of Israel to the land of Canaan in the millennium, I think that we have a consistency with regard to our harmony of the biblical texts that maybe some others don't have.
Yeah, and I think in general, what we're saying, I think the reality is both of us, and really all of us on this podcast, have friends who are very much decidedly in the dispensational camp, and then friends who are very much decidedly in the Reformed camp. In the, whether that be Reformed Baptist, whether it be 1689 Federalist, whether it be Westminsterian. The reality is we kind of move in these different circles and different worlds. And a lot of times, what some of our friends say, is exclusive to their view, that would exclude the others of our friends. We want to say, okay, well, let's really let me really see that fleshed out. Let me really see the flashpoint of why this truth is mutually exclusive with that truth. And a lot of times, I just don't think that argument gets made very clearly. I think that people gloss over things because they've embraced the system, they've embraced a label, and they feel like, well, no, if I give any movement toward this other thing, then I'm not being faithful to my hermeneutical commitments or theological system commitments or whatever else. And the reality is I want to create space to see that, there is indeed a lot of overlap. I mean, I think this began for me when I first read the Westminster Confession, the Savoy Declaration, and the Second London Baptist Confession sort of side by side, and walk through them and just notice how much I could affirm without hesitation
Mm.
in those confessions. Not everything, obviously, and of course those three are different from one another in different areas. But like just as a sort of as a card carrying, happy to wear the label dispensationalist at the Master's Seminary, I thought, my goodness, a lot of what's being affirmed here that I think had the impression that I can't affirm, is precisely not is what we already affirm, is what we teach, and what we've heard taught from John MacArthur's pulpit for so many years. And so as I kept pushing, I realized, I wonder, as you see, there's a great website that has the three of them, uh, lined right up next to each other, so you can see all the differences. And I started thinking, the the changes from Westminster to London Baptist, Second London Baptist, might actually be larger and more frequent and more significant than the changes that I would have to make, uh, if I were to revise the 1689 to fit with my own theology, with my own understanding of
Mm.
Calvinistic dispensationalism. And so if the Reformed Baptists are legitimately called Reformed, and coming out of the particular Baptist stream of the Magisterial Reformation, and they're granted their differing views on polity and the doctrine of baptism, credo versus paedo baptism. Are we really um, that far off from the Reformed Baptists, on differences as large as polity and the doctrine of baptism? I actually don't think so. And so, Reformed dispensationalism is sort of a way of saying, as the Reformed Baptists were welcome to the Reformed table, so to speak, because of those somewhat significant differences, you know, uh, our is not our brand of doctrine, our understanding of Reformed theology, coupled with that understanding of Israel, and hermeneutical commitments. Um, is that not compatible? At least, obviously acknowledging distinctions, but compatible enough to say we can wear the moniker Reformed as well, and have these distinctives.
Well, and I think one thing to throw in with that, especially with the London Baptist Confession, and you look at it with regard to, and again, historically, do we fit? Can we accept something like that or adopt something like that? At least on a large scale. And what I found interesting as I've studied that, over the course of the years, is that a lot of guys are not familiar with the fact that even back then they allowed for two levels of disagreement among people who signed the confession. Even in the
Mm.
Westminster Confession, you look at Baxter, and he's way out there, and I don't even know how they let him sign it. But nevertheless, they have what are called scruples, and that's where you maybe have a disagreement with a word. So, for example, there might be in the London Baptist Confession the reference to the Old Testament saints as the church. You could take a scruple with that, right, as a Reformed Baptist, and say, I think it'd be better to phrase that differently, like Old Testament saints instead of the church, right? And that would be acceptable based on the ecclesiological government over that, who would accept you into their, community, whether or not they would allow for that disagreement. A higher level of disagreement would be exceptions. That's where you read like an article or even a full sentence, or a term, and you say, I don't agree with that. So, for example, John Murray didn't like the word covenant of works. So he took an exception to that, and he was still obviously allowed to be a teacher at the Westminster Theological Seminary, you know. So you're allowed to have scruples and exceptions within the covenant or within the community of Reformed believers. And what I find even more interesting is that there are those out there who would think that, yeah, we're like unicorns and we're leprechauns that don't exist or whatever, is that in some of the biggest institutions, even today, there are professors who take, I don't know, 93 exceptions or so to the Westminster Confession, more than even I take to the
Mm.
Westminster Confession. And I would change their entire, ecclesiology slash baptism to be, London Baptist. So I can take less exceptions than even current teachers in many Reformed schools. and yet that's allowable. So I think that with us, it's saying that, for one, we want to maintain the fact that we are not creating our faith on our own, on Monday morning quarterbacking this thing. I'm the pope of my own church. And we want to reach back into our history to say, okay, if these things are biblical, then we should adopt them and accept them. And that's the key.
And one more thing, and then we'll move. I know you want to get to the next question. Can't believe we've done this on one question already. But, you know, the big thing is what happens is some guys, see the legitimate differences. There are differences between, where we're at and certain aspects of the 1689 confession. But what I think happens is that folks in our camp then can see those differences and think, oh, that means that I need to reject these other things. But that I don't think we need to reject, things like, things that often get done in this particular conversation is a lot of people think, oh, I can't embrace the doctrine of particular redemption because, that requires a covenant of redemption. I can't embrace the doctrine of the federal headship of Adam because that requires a covenant of works, or the active obedience of Christ because that requires a covenant of works, right? And the reality is those doctrines, federal headship of Adam, active obedience, particular redemption, do not require some sort of departure from your dispensational distinctives. There's convergence, there's overlapping, there is a mutual inclusion and inclusivity among these two systems of theology that don't necessarily create the friction that you think is there. And so we're trying to say, don't be quick to dismiss these other doctrines that are not uniquely, call them Reformed doctrines, right? Because you want to be a dispensationalist. And so also I would say, don't reject these what you think are uniquely dispensational doctrines because, you feel like, oh, I've got to be Reformed. And so I can't hold to those things. We want to be able to pull together where we can pull together and of course, be honest about where we really do still disagree on things.
I mean, even when you're looking at from just this, I know this might be a little, you want me to move on, huh? Is that what you're telling me?
Yeah, move on.
Fine. Unbelievable. I have things going in my head. It's gold. I'll just leave it out there.
No, go,
more.
Peter. We can cut it out.
Keep going, Peter. Keep going.
No, I was just saying, I think that when you're doing doctrinal triage and you're starting to look back at, okay, who can I associate with? What groups do I want to, allow my church to associate with? What kind of books do I want to recommend? Things like that. I think that it's important to look at the level of importance with regard to doctrine. Like, if someone is a pre-trib, premillennial, future restoration of Israel and of Canaan, millennial temple, and they got all that right, but yet they have a defunct doctrine of God, I don't think their dispensationalism does an ounce a bit of good. So you have to recognize that, yes, I think the harmony of the biblical text, no part of the Bible is less important than any other part of the Bible. We want to get the beginning right, 6-day creation, literal Adam, all of that. And we get the end right, future restoration of geopolitical Israel, millennial reign. But we also have to recognize, too, though, that we can't just, we have to recognize, again, that the doctrines of soteriology, doctrine of God, are vital issues that we don't want to, give any inch on, just for the sake of unity with dispensationalists,
That's so helpful. Thank you. So as we consider, we have, for lack of a much better term, a brand of dispensationalism that we're calling Reformed. Why do we want to retain the label dispensationalism? Why not just another version of Reformed Baptists? What are the liabilities of the name dispensationalism? And then in spite of those, why do we want to retain that label?
Yeah, it's interesting because, I think in the dispensational versus covenantal debate, I really do think that I think the labels have gotten unhelpful. Dispensationalism isn't really about 7 dispensations or 8 or 3 or whatever it is. And covenantalism really isn't, the way that it's used in contradistinction to dispensationalism, isn't really about covenants. The distinctions between the two systems, I think, center much more around hermeneutics. And as the result of that hermeneutical difference in what we do with our understanding of Israel, right? So, I think that a good thing about dispensationalism is its dogged insistence upon literal, grammatical, historical hermeneutics, that the proper interpretation of any biblical text is discovered by the application of the rules of grammar and the facts of history to get at the intent of the author. And, it has become popular today to move away from authorial intent and really even to deride it as, how could you ever get in the head of somebody else, and say, well, there were two authors, divine and human, and so that we need to be able to get to, the divine authorial intent, which is sometimes broader or different than the human authorial intent. And I think that is well-meaning but misguided, because the reality is God intended that the human author intend what they intend. And so to say that there's a divine intent that's broader than the human intent is sort of like saying God intended the human author to intend less than God intended. And I just don't think that that's a coherent notion. And I don't think it in practice it works out to anything that's viable. I understand what they're trying to get at. Not every single thing about every text is known in the immediately as that text is revealed. Let us make man in our own image, right? Well, what is that plural referring to? Is it any indication of plurality in the Godhead? Well, yeah, I actually think it is. Was Adam able to know that? Well, maybe not Adam in the moment, but I think by the time it was written in 1440s, as it's revealed to Moses, that Moses would have known something about that, and perhaps the original audience of Israel was able to understand something of the plurality of God's, um, you know, tri-personality, right? But the notion that later texts build upon, add to, clarify, give significance of earlier texts, that we agree on. But what we deny is that later texts reinterpret or change the meaning of earlier texts in such a way that the original audience could not have understood. Now, that involves a distinction between a technical distinction between meaning and significance, between interpretation and application. But I think when we hammer those differences out, and by and large, I don't think that they've been hammered out in genuine conversation in public or in print right now. I think that there's a lot of talking to one's own camps and not really talking to one another. But I think if we really could hammer those differences out, we might be able to see some kind of rapprochement. But if not, I mean, the reality is I think that dispensationalism gets that right. I think that sort of single meaning, authorial intent hermeneutics is the only consistent way to treat the whole Bible as God's communication to man, and not as riddles or sort of obscure, blurry, certain revelation, not sort of half revelation, in the Old Testament.
Something to add to that too. I mean, I think sometimes on the guys on the more harder dispensational side, um, they neglect the fact that there is latent theology in the mind of the author, and that we can pull that out and understand that through the literal grammatical hermeneutic. But he knows a lot more than what he puts on the page,
Right.
and his audience understands a lot more than what sometimes people are willing to give them credit for. So I think it's also important as we're doing the grammatical hermeneutic, um, historical grammatical hermeneutic. I think it's important to recognize that they understood a whole lot more than what we give them credit for. And again, there's latent theology. Those are things we also have to consider as well as we're doing the interpretive task of looking at a particular text.
Yeah.
And I don't think you can read just one verse in Genesis chapter 1 and not read Deuteronomy, for example, and realize same author, the Pentateuch, all written by Moses, every single word. And because of that, there's theology that he has that, of course, what you read came later, but all of that was given to Moses and he wrote it all down. And so Moses has words that he uses in Genesis that he will also use in Leviticus and in Deuteronomy. And in order to understand what he's saying in Genesis, sometimes we do have to look at later revelation from Moses, where he's clear about a particular topic, for example.
Sure. And I think it's reasonable to say too that, what I've said there doesn't mean that we, as people who are on this side of the cross with the benefit of the full revelation, the sufficient revelation of God, Old and New Testaments, ignore later revelation in our seeking to understand the full breadth of significance of earlier revelation. But we do want to respect what the original author it could have intended and what the original audience could have understood or should have been liable to understand. But I agree with you, Peter, that I think a lot of times it's quite a bit more often than folks are willing to give folks credit for.
And I think whenever you go to preach, like let's say in Genesis, you're trying to figure out who is the Messiah. You wouldn't just stop short of giving people the answer that's given in the Pentateuch and in the Lion of the tribe of Judah, Jesus Christ. You'd take them all the way through that in any kind of preaching setting. You wouldn't just leave them hanging, wondering, well, who's the Messiah going to be?
Right.
Maybe it's
and that's
Job,
the difference between like the Christotelic versus Christocentric and things like that. But then
Mm.
applying those hermeneutics, I mean, also again, we've talked about it just briefly, so I'll only just mention it again. But when you apply that literal, grammatical, historical hermeneutic, I believe what you get is an understanding of Israel that shows that Israel is distinct from the New Testament people of God, the church, so that we should not read the New Testament as the spiritual Israel of God, as is often urged from Galatians 6:16, or that Romans 9:6 means that that not all Israel is Israel means, well, actually the church is Israel. No, that's not what those things mean. They mean that not everyone who was a physical descendant of Jacob was also a believer in Yahweh and belonged to Yahweh. But the Israel of God isn't anybody who believes in Yahweh. It's an ethnic Jew who also believes in Yahweh. And when you sort of apply the hermeneutic to all of the relevant passages, you do wind up getting that distinction. I mean, John MacArthur said he was asked one time, John, what's your thoughts on dispensationalism? I know you kind of grew up that way, but you've been more involved in Reformed theology. And Pastor John says in that Q&A, you want to know what my dispensationalism is? Here it is, period. There's a distinction between the church and Israel. And that distinction between church and Israel means that there's a coming kingdom for Israel, as is literally promised in the Old Testament. And I think that that's what you get as an expectation from the Old Testament prophets, places like Jeremiah 30 to 33, Ezekiel 20, Ezekiel 30 to 36, those areas of prophecy. And of course, building on all of it, in Isaiah 65, all of these, Isaiah 2, Isaiah 25, and then coming, of course, and culminating in Revelation 20, where we get the clear statement of it being 1,000 years on the earth, and so on. So all of those things, I think, are things we want to retain about dispensationalism. Perhaps the label dispensationalism doesn't help because it's not about dispensations, but that's what we want to retain.
Yeah, at least those two things, right?
Right.
There are some plans that are promised in the Old Testament to the nation of Israel that haven't been fulfilled, and they will be fulfilled in the future, right?
Right.
So at least if you're, at the bare minimum, like that's a barest common denominator type of dispensationalism that you'd want to maintain. Where the title
Yes.
itself, you can throw it out, you can do whatever you want.
Thanks, guys. Yeah, so there's aspects, important distinctions that are kind of associated through that word dispensational that we want to maintain. The other word I guess we've used there is reformed, and what are aspects of why would the word reformed be important to use, and why not something just like Calvinistic dispensationalist? Why would that particular word be useful?
Yeah, I think Calvinistic dispensationalist has I mean it basically has been used to describe folks that are, I think, largely in the stream of dispensational systems, but who also have come to recognize the truth of the doctrines of grace, and in some cases, maybe not even all of them. I think a lot of quote unquote Calvinistic dispensationalists have been 4-point Calvinists, those who embrace the T, U, I, and P, but not the L of tulip. And I think that I just think that there's more richness and sweetness and truth from the scriptures to glean than that. And in particular, so if the Calvinistic dispensational group kind of originated within dispensational systems and sort of brought a couple of reformed truths or reformed soteriological truths along for the ride, they were convictionally dispensational, but they also happened to also be Calvinistic. I think where we see ourselves is originating more in the stream of, genuine magisterial Reformation theology, where we are, obviously we're not magisterial reformers because we're not Paedo-Baptists, but I think the English particular Baptists stem from the magisterial Reformation more than from the radical Reformation, that we are more particular Baptist than Anabaptist, that we are convictionally
Amen.
reformed in all of what that meant, even in the 17th century. I mentioned before, the classical doctrine of God that had been stewarded throughout the ages, that was found in the Orthodox creeds of Nicaea and Chalcedon, of Constantinople, and affirmed throughout the ages. That's not just sort of marginally reformed. Like the Reformed theologians insisted upon a classical doctrine of God, the classical doctrine of the Trinity, right? The eternal generation, eternal procession, the richness of Trinitarian orthodoxy from the Athanasian Creed and before. We want all that. Doctrine of Scripture, doctrine of Christ, right? The Chalcedonian understanding of the hypostatic union and the rejections of Nestorianism and Monophysitism and Arianism and adoptionism and all these isms, right? Even down through the seventh, was it the seventh ecumenical council or sixth, maybe the sixth ecumenical council, Constantinople III in 680 and 681, and the rejection of monothelitism. The Reformed divines of the 17th century felt all of that history as their birthright, and they didn't just bring it along, they insisted upon it, and they insisted upon it as a rich heritage that they wouldn't let go. I feel the same way about that. I think the scriptures give us the reason to affirm all of that and insist on all of that, especially in the face of some modern challenges, which I think really deny the Reformed doctrine of God. There's some accounts of God and the Trinity that are in the Reformed churches, and those who would say they're confessionally Reformed, who I think don't actually embrace the authorial intent of their own confession, because the theistic mutualist understanding of God is running rampant these days. And so when I think, to put a bow on it, we are Reformed teachers, theologians, whatever, who are also dispensational in our understanding of the kingdom of hermeneutics of Israel, rather than being like squarely within a dispensational system who just happen to also be Calvinistic.
Yeah, I agree.
It's
I
a great
think
way to put it.
the Calvinistic label becomes limited to just the 5 points, which I affirm with all my heart would die for them. And again, most of the guys are even 4-pointers who came from that kind of perspective. Out of the more radical Reformation, it's just me and my Bible, and I'm going to create this as I go. The other thing I want to just add real quick too is with regard to keeping Reformed as part of it, as Mike said so well, Reformed doctrine of God, Reformed doctrine of Christ. The result of that would mean we would repudiate any kind of kenotic Christology, relational theism. We would deny 2 modes of existence or a simplicity by which God is complex, or any of those other kind of things that aren't truly reformed according to the Reformed confessions, that we also see are helpful tools for us, and then the other things we also want to embrace. Right? We're not just 5-point Calvinists. We're Reformed in a broader respective doctrine than just the 5 points.
Mm.
Hey, Peter, particularly so many people would criticize our view potentially and say something like, look, dispensationalism's so new. These guys are arguing, trying to say we're part of this reformed historical, so many things. Has there been any evidence of our, I guess, our particular dispensational leaning truths prior to Darby, prior to recent dispensational theologians?
I mean, there's a number of tenets that we've expressed here with regard to what we think dispensationalism is. The promises that haven't been completely fulfilled, still to be done in the future, being one of those. A distinction between the church and Israel, and a restoration of Israel to the land of Palestine. Let's say it's just those 3 tenets, right? There could be others, but let's say there's those three tenets. Those have a long history dating back to even the highest Orthodox period of the 16th and 17th century of English, Puritanism. There's a number of resources we can look at. I mean, there's tons of great quotes. I'll just share a few, I guess. Owen, in his commentary on Hebrews, he says in the first volume of the Hebrews set, on page 434 and 435, I'll just read some excerpts. It's kind of remarkable. Again, if those three tenets are what we think are essential to being dispensational, look at what he says. He says, moreover, it is granted that there shall be a time and season during the continuance of the kingdom of the Messiah in this world, wherein the generality of the nations of the Jews, all the world over, shall be called and effectually brought to the knowledge of the Messiah, our Lord Jesus Christ,
Wow.
with which mercy shall also receive deliverance from their captivity, restoration unto their own land, with a blessed flourishing and happy condition therein. And then he continues on. He says, this thing itself is acknowledged, as far as I can understand, by all the world that have any acquaintance with these things. Christians generally do assert it, look for it, pray for it, and have done so in all ages from the days of the apostles. And then he gives the position of the Muslims. He says, what do the Muslims say? And then he goes, well, what about the Jews? He says this, what is it then that the Jews plead about themselves in the future? What do they expect? What promises are given to them? They say that they shall be delivered out of their captivity, restored to their own land. So that's more than just salvation, restoration to the land. Enjoy
Incredible.
peace and quietness, glory and honor therein. We say the same thing concerning them also.
Wow.
And then he continues, says, but by whom will these things be brought about, right? And then he goes through the difference between what the Jews say and then what the Christians say. He says, here then lies the only difference between us. We acknowledge that the promises mentioned, there you go, are not yet all of them actually fulfilled towards them. This is also, they also plead. The reason, though, that they say is because the Messiah has not yet come, and so they cast blame on God. We say the reason is because they have not come to faith and obedience to the Messiah, who long since came to them. So it's pretty remarkable there that in Owen, again, no one's questioning Owen's Reformed heritage and credentials, that he says that there'll be a restoration. There are promises that haven't been fulfilled to Israel that will be fulfilled to Israel in the restoration and blessings of the land.
You see, that's really remarkable and prominent, because part of the so-called covenantal hermeneutic, the so-called non-dispensational hermeneutic, is right. All of the promises of God that were promised to Israel were fulfilled in Christ's first coming. Right. That as many are the promises of God, and they are yes in Him. 2 Corinthians 1:20, and that gets used to say, right, all those promises are first coming. Since they don't get fulfilled literally, well, then they must be fulfilled spiritually, and therefore Israel is the church, or the church is the new Israel. And Owen is flat out saying there are promises that were fulfilled during the first coming of Christ, but there are also promises to Israel that are going to be fulfilled still yet in the future. That's really significant, and I've heard that line of argumentation in our Theology 4 classes. I've read it in our faculty's books explaining dispensational hermeneutics. That's really striking.
And I just think, again, I'm not saying Owen or even the Puritan English guys agree with everything that we would say. I'm just saying the seeds of it didn't begin with Darby, right? The distinction between the church and Israel and a future fulfillment of some promises of the Old Testament didn't begin with Darby. Another example I'll just throw out there real quick. Wellness of Brakel, Volume 4, has a ton of stuff that's really good. Page 347, I'll read just a quick excerpt. Again, that idea that there's still things yet to come before Jesus comes, that's a kind of a pre-trib type of idea. Now, I'm not saying he holds to pre-trib, but the idea that there's things still yet to happen on this earth. Here's what he says. Even though the Lord has concealed the precise moment from us about his coming, he has nevertheless given us several signs in his word which must precede Christ's coming unto judgment. Some of these have already been fulfilled to a large extent, such as the powerful delusion, by many ways of heresies, false prophets, apostasy, terrifying. He goes through a list. He says, there are yet matters, however, which are to be fulfilled prior to Christ's coming to judgment. And what are these? He says this, there must yet be the destruction of the city of Rome, the throne of the beast, Revelation 16. So for him, Revelation 16:13 is still future. The undressing, forsaking, and contemptuous rejection of the harlot of Babylon, Revelation 17, future. The eradication of her empire, Revelation 18 and 19:2, he quotes, still future. The conversion of the entire Jewish nation to the acknowledgement that Jesus is the Messiah, Romans 11:15. And then he says, the glorious millennial state of the church upon the earth, the rebellion of Gog and Magog, which will follow this, Revelation 20, is still yet future. And the time when they'll be encompassed upon, the earth. And then that's in that part. Then one other section I just want to read real quick is out of his question about the return of the Jews to Canaan, proven from various Old Testament texts. This is in page 531 of volume 4. Again, it's long, but I'll just read one section. He says this. They, talking about Jews, will be an independent republic governed by a very wise, good nature, and superb government. Furthermore, Canaan will be extraordinarily fruitful, and its inhabitants will be eminently godly, and they will constitute a segment of the glorious state of the church during the 1,000 years prophesied in Revelation 20. Very similar to what we're saying here. Again, I'm not saying it's identical. I'm saying the seeds of what we're saying today were born during the English Protestant Reformation.
And you know what else? The thing that's kind of just blaring in my mind is Owen and Brakel believed in the theological covenants.
Oh, yeah.
They believed in the covenant of grace, works, redemption, right? There are going to be varying degrees of opinions about, what those constructs are, what the best thing to call them is. But a lot of guys in our camp are really, really up in arms about us saying something like, look, whatever you want to call it, let's not miss the truths that are being presented behind these labels. These guys embraced the truths and the labels hook, line, and sinker, and they were still able to affirm what sounds almost identical to what we want to affirm about Israel and the coming kingdom, right?
I mean,
that's a really good point.
And it's
Amen.
more
That's a
than
really
just
good point.
salvation of Jews, right? Because we could go through all of church history and show how Romans 11 is used about conversion of Jews. That's what a lot of guys do. It's very simplistic. But it's also about the restoration of them to their land. John Gill said this. He says, the conversions of the Jews and the settlement of them in their own land. And he says that in the body of divinity, right? So that restoration of Israel to the land to fulfill Old Testament promises that haven't yet been fulfilled is really the hallmark of what we're saying. And we can find it in particular Baptists. We can find it in the high Orthodox period of the 16th and 17th, Elizabethan period of the Protestant.
And let me take a shot at what I was saying there before. So the criticism comes, if you embrace the covenant of redemption, covenant of works, and so on, you are admitting certain hermeneutical moves that, if you were to practice them consistently, would get you to say that Israel is the church is Israel, and it would, undo this land promise and the kingdom promise. And my point is, well, evidently not for Owen, and evidently not for Brakel. I'm not advocating that we embrace their hermeneutics, but I am saying that maybe their affirmation of an intra-Trinitarian agreement between the persons of the Trinity from before the foundation of the world, in which roles about the accomplishment of redemption were outlined and assigned and everything is determined, maybe that doesn't actually make you get you committed to hermeneutical commitments that undo certain aspects of your dispensational theology. I don't think they do. Trying to see a probationary period in the garden where Adam is not only threatened disobedience or threatened punishment for disobedience, but implicitly promised life for obedience, wherein if he had obeyed, he would have brought him and his federates, to a state where he could not have fallen, where his righteousness was confirmed, right? Of course, that was never going to happen. It was always the plan for Christ to come, always the cross. But if that is sort of the arrangement in the garden, does affirming that require you to then see Israel as the church or the church Israel? No, it doesn't. And I think some of the guys coming out of our camp who have since embraced a version of covenant theology have done that because they thought they had to choose between the two. And evidently Owen didn't choose between the two. And Brakel didn't choose between the two. I don't think I'm choosing between the two. And so I think it goes both ways. There are dispensationalists who are they cut themselves off from some of the blessings of the biblical truths behind the doctrines of theological covenants of Reformed theology, and there are guys who have moved to reject certain, I think, dispensational truths because they saw the truth of those other things and said, "Oh, I can't have them both." I actually think you can have them both.
Exactly.
Hey, Peter, is there any evidence of maybe thinking the other way? There's some aspects we can see within the Reformed tradition where these dispensational distinctives have been present, but have there been, in the history of a dispensationalism, have there been those that weren't allergic to the concept of theological covenants?
Yeah, and I think that's something Mike just summarized super well too, is that you don't have to put up a dividing wall between the two, that you can affirm by name or not by name, by principle or name, the covenants of covenant theology. One of the, I would say, preeminent dispensational scholars in a book, Dispensationalism, Essential Beliefs and Common Myths, says this, quote, "The covenants of covenant theology are not what's most important. Traditionally, three covenants have been affirmed in covenant theology: covenant of redemption, covenant of works, and covenant of grace. Yet covenantalists themselves have not agreed on these covenants, some rejecting one or two of these, and that's true." He continues. Plus, they have not always agreed on what these covenants should be called. Also true. And then he says this. Also, some dispensationalists have affirmed one or all three of these covenants while remaining dispensationalists. So I don't believe the covenants of covenant theology are the main issue separating the two systems. So if it can be affirmed that you can be a dispensationalist and affirm one, two, three, or any of the covenants of covenant theology, you're not all of a sudden no longer dispensational, by probably one of the best dispensational scholars I've ever met, pretty good. Go back further. Charles Ryrie, in his book, Dispensationalism, on page 189, says, quote, "The ideas and concepts contained in the covenant of works and the covenant of grace are not unscriptural," meaning they're biblical, they're scriptural, so it's certainly acceptable. S. Lewis Johnson has an entire lecture defending the covenant of redemption. We could look at a number of different things. It could be called the Pactum Salutis, which our pastor uses in Biblical Doctrine, page 513. Again, one thing I think as well, when Pastor John was preaching through Titus 1:1-3, he's very willing to use the title covenant redemption, knowing what it means. He said this, he said, "Listen carefully." Okay, quote, "Listen carefully. The covenant of redemption, the covenant to redeem man, was ratified before creation. It was ratified before time. Look at Hebrews 13." And he quotes Hebrews 13:20. And then he says, "The God of peace, the same God who resurrected Jesus Christ through the blood of the eternal covenant, there was an eternal covenant that God made before time began, which was the covenant of redemption." So
Hmm.
I don't think that dispensationalists have to be afraid of using those terms, but I don't think we're obviously either obligated by them either. I love John Murray, probably one of my favorite guys. He didn't like using the word covenant of works, so he talked about the Adamic administration. He believed in the principle. Anybody who's read his section on the Adamic administration will say, well, that's how everyone's defined the covenant of works. And I appreciate and respect the fact that he's trying in his own approach to be faithful to the biblical text, and how he thinks the word covenant is not used there, so I'm not going to use it there. So he calls it something else, the Adamic administration. I can respect that. It's totally acceptable. He's trying to do justice to the biblical text. But dispensationalists historically have been fine with the covenants of covenant theology, so much so that Darby and Schofield and a lot of the early dispensationalists came out of Presbyterianism and affirmed the Westminster Confession. So they baptized babies. They believed in the threefold covenants of covenant theology. And yet they were, having their own version of dispensationalism, which we wouldn't necessarily affirm. But nevertheless, the two aren't mutually exclusive, I think, as Mike was saying earlier.
That's so helpful, and hopefully, listeners, you're beginning to get greater clarity on what we believe and obviously don't believe, and getting a more clearer picture of Reformed dispensationalism. It's probably good at this juncture to then discuss and ask the question, okay, what brand of dispensationalism are we talking about specifically? Is this classic or traditional dispensationalism in the vein of Schofield and Schaeffer? Is it modified or revised dispensationalism like Ryrie? Or is it progressive dispensationalism in the vein of Blazing, Bach, and Saucy? Where are we at?
Yeah, it's a good question, and those taxonomies of the different movements of dispensationalism are notoriously hard to pin down, and also make the great, a great fodder for, research and stuff. I think that, we're classic and traditional dispensationalism. Obviously, some of the earliest things that came out of that, were needed to be shed. There were things like two new covenants: one new covenant for the church, one new covenant for Israel. Things like the church being the heavenly people of God forever, living in the new heavens for eternity, and the Israel being the earthly people of God, living on the new earth for eternity, with these sort of separate um, destinies, even as the totally separate peoples of God. I think that needed to be shed. The idea of that the Sermon on the Mount is, for a later kingdom era, rather than showing the principles and ethics for life in Christ today. Those are things that, I think Pastor John had a quote about leaving those kinds of things behind. Would you have that
Yeah.
quote?
Yeah, I mean, John said, it's in the Gospel according to the Apostles, page 205. He says, quote, "Frankly, some mongrel species of dispensationalism ought to die. Now I'll be happy to join their cortege," which is their funeral procession. And that's why, John's called himself like a leaky dispensationalist. And when I think about the different kinds, again, obviously, I personally be much more progressive in the vein of like a Saucy or something, Soci. But I think that's why we need a version that we're calling Reformed Dispensationalism, because there is a progress that's happened naturally that takes the fact that there's only one plan of salvation from before the foundation of the world, designed by God over the elect and reprobate, fulfilled in Christ, applied by the Holy Spirit, um, more seriously than perhaps oldest generation of dispensationalism didn't affirm.
Yeah. And so where classic dispensationalism had those shortcomings, I think the modified or revised system, they were saying, okay, no, there's not two new covenants, but it is a new covenant with Israel that only gets applied to the church. It's sort of like the church is sort of second class in its access to these covenant blessings because, well, Jeremiah 31 says it's a new covenant with the house of Israel and the house of Judah. And I don't think that's right. I think that the progressives get it better when they say, no, the new covenant is made with the church, and it will also be made, with Israel when she is, regathered and looks upon the one whom, they've pierced, and they mourn for him as an only son, and Israel's converted. It's not two new covenants or a covenant that sort of the church skates into. It's genuinely the church, is the federates of the new covenant. One place though that I don't follow the progressive dispensationalists, is they see Jesus sort of either partially reigning or initially reigning on the Davidic throne in the present age. I know that there are different dispensationalists will disagree on this, but I think that the Davidic kingdom that is promised in the Old Testament is entirely future, because you have Matthew 25:31 saying that Jesus is going to sit on his glorious throne when he comes in power with the angels. And that's obviously a reference to the second coming. And you say, well, his glorious throne, isn't he on a throne right now? Well, in Revelation 3:21, Jesus actually is he's speaking there, and he distinguishes the throne of his father, which he says he sits on now, and his throne, which we understand to be the Davidic throne. So if his throne is the Davidic throne and his father's throne is distinct from that, and that's what he's sitting on now, it's not saying Jesus isn't king. It's not saying
Hmm.
Jesus isn't reigning as Lord
Which is
of the
so important to
universe.
distinguish.
It's so important. Nobody is saying Jesus isn't king or isn't reigning. What we're saying is this specific aspect of the mediatorial kingdom, the Davidic reign, as promised in the Old Testament, is not yet being fulfilled, and it will be fulfilled when the Messiah returns and sits in Jerusalem on David's throne in Jerusalem, and reigns for 1,000 years. So that's technically somewhere between like the revised, modified, and the progressive dispensationalism. I think Dr. Michael Vlach articulates this view better than anybody that I've heard or read. He continues to write on it and affirm that, and I would affirm that understanding of that. But in saying Are we classic? No. Are we revised in some ways, but we want to push past that? Are we progressive? Well, in some ways, but in other ways, not quite. I think the point is back to that MacArthur quote. What's your dispensationalism? Right. Israel's distinct from the church. Israel's restored as a nation to her land, gets her promises and her 1,000-year reign of Messiah in fulfillment of the Old Testament promises interpreted literally. And so I think, that's where we are, alongside this wonderful, humongous freight train of Reformed theology in all of those other areas, which we happily affirm.
That's so wonderful, and thank you so much for that. We do get to affirm truths like the active obedience of Christ, a very particular redemption and the like. And we're all on a journey, and I can remember, we have friends who graduated from TMS back in the mid to late 80s, who told us back then that the debate amongst the faculty was whether or not election was conditional or not. And then when we were at seminary, there was some debate as to whether or not it was a particular actual redemption or not. And now here we are in 2023, and you guys are full-time theology professors at the seminary, and the view for the most part is that it is a very particular redemption. Active obedience of Christ is a biblical doctrine. And so we're seeing a progression. Now that, for us, what we were taught at the seminary, the hermeneutic that we are committed to, that actually informs and ensures that the train doesn't keep going off the cliff into areas where we wouldn't be. We're actually committed, as we've said throughout this podcast, to a future for Israel, both a restoration and a salvation. We have our dispensational distinctives, but our hermeneutic also leads us to things like active obedience, a particular redemption, and we don't have an allergen to those. And so we're so thankful for that. Brothers, we're so thankful for your time. This has been really, really great. Listeners, we hope that this has been a great blessing to you. And guys, have a wonderful, wonderful day. I know you guys are busy. You got a lot that's on your plate, and we're so thankful for the time that you've spent with us. And we look forward to having you on again sometime soon.
Thanks, we love you guys. Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
No Lasting City is a ministry of Riverbend Bible Church in Hastings, New Zealand. For more information, please visit our website, riverbend.org.nz, or visit us on YouTube. Follow us on social media where you can interact with us or ask us any questions. Our links are in the show notes, and we'd love to see you there.